Chapter 17. The document! All the time in the snow, when he and Mr. Mansfield had been alone, the precious item had been within his grasp, and he'd forgotten it. Forgotten it so entirely that its sudden appearance before the cottage fire was almost terrifying. Take it, Smith, and tell me what old Mr. Field had to say. Fearfully, Smith reached out his hand and took the document. 10,000 thoughts, fears, and questions filled his head. Why had he been given it now? Why the enormous trust? Didn't the magistrate still believe him to be a murderer? But what other choice had he in his condition? Trust was obligatory, a necessary quality of life. Smith, read, Smith, don't be afraid, read. So Smith crouched down at the blind man's feet, close to the fire where the light was sufficient. And as he sat, Mr. Mansfield's hand dropped by chance on his shoulder, then moved lightly upward and rested on his head. Smith read, slowly, shakily, for he was not over-proficient, and the writing was crabbed, and there were words he could not pronounce. Neither confession nor deed nor to property was the document. It was a letter to Mr. Leonard, a strange letter of uncanny power in the firelit room. For as Smith read on, murdered old Mr. Field seemed to creep into the parlour and cast his cold shadow between the blind man and the boy, so that Mr. Mansfield shivered and withdrew his hand from Smith's head, and Smith shrank back towards his own side of the fire. The old man had written in deep agitation. Something had disturbed and shaken him profoundly. Also, there was fear, of a distressing kind. He knew his life to be threatened. Several times he mentioned it. I lie awake of nights, Leonard, and hear such sounds, and have such thoughts at my age. Then later he wrote of a discovery he'd made, but did not say what, only that he meant to carry it to his grave. A terrible discovery. This also was repeated and underlined. A terrible, terrible discovery. But now came an oddity, an instruction quite plain and without any of the confused fears that invaded the rest of the document. The trifle was underlined, I wrote you of previously, is buried in a shrewd place. Andrews knows where. Ask him where Jack used to play as a boy. When you have it, dispose of it as pleases you. I shall care no longer. There followed some bitter and pathetic words of the world in general, all once more in a very agitated manner, together with a last reference to his discovery, reaffirming his intention of carrying it to the grave, where it would be hidden and forgot forever. Smith stopped reading. There was a restless silence in which the fire leapt and cast strange lightnings across the blind man's face. Go on, Mr. Mansfield said. There's nothing more. Nothing? Nothing, muttered Smith. Or do you think I'm hiding the rest from you? He scowled furiously into the fire. His heart felt grievously empty. The document, the precious item that was to have raised him up in the world, nothing but an old man's misery and dread and whereabouts of a trifle, a locket, most likely, or a brooch with a twist of his grandmother's hair. For this he'd endured so much. He stared at the paper through which the fire shone redly and noted the stains made by his own sweat when he'd first... Go on, Mr. Mansfield said. There's nothing more. Nothing? Nothing, muttered Smith. Or do you think I'm hiding the rest from you? He scowled furiously into the fire. His heart felt grievously empty. The document, the precious item that was to raise him up in the world, nothing but an old man's misery and dread and whereabouts of a trifle, a locket, most likely, or a brooch with a twist of his grandmother's hair. For this he'd endured so much. He stared at the paper through which the fire shone redly and noted the stains made by his own sweat when first he'd fled from the men in brown. Then he remembered his grief when he thought the document had been destroyed, and then his joy when he discovered it was safe. He remembered Miss Fanny's hopes in it, not much less than his own, and now, not even a whereas or a felonious or a property to justify a family's dreams. Goodness. And the old man had been killed for it. The discovery, whispered Mr. Mansfield. What was it? Took it with him to the grave, said Smith dully. Dead man's wish to be respected, remember? Mr. Mansfield shook his head. We must know it, Smith. There'll be no peace otherwise. You find out on your own, Mr. Mansfield. I'm done with it. I'm off. But I'm blind, Smith. I need your eyes. Your daughter's eyes are just as sharp. Not so. They're partial. They're dimmed by affection. Yours, Smith, are clear. Smith, whose eyes were, at that time, anything but clear, being misted with tears of disappointment and a general dissatisfaction with the world, nodded. True enough, Mr. Mansfield frowned, and his projecting brows hid his empty eyes in pools of darkness, so that, to an ignorant glance, he was no more blind than the boy. What did you hope for from the document? Great riches? Power? What was it, Smith, that you struggled so hugely for? Smith did not answer, partly on account of the obscure danger against the magistrate, and partly because he'd never had a clear notion of what he'd hoped for, save to make his way in the world. Up in the world. Mr. Mansfield waited, seeming to stare into the fire. Little by little, his head sank once more onto his chest. Smith watched him. Surely he was asleep. Maybe half an hour passed. Smith! I'm here. I thought you'd gone. You said you were going. Have you changed your mind? I'll go in the morning. Once more there was silence, a long silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the blind man's regular breathing. Desolately, Smith stared at the unlucky document. The words jiggled and danced before his tired eyes, but never again to shape themselves into the mystery of hope. Why had the old man been killed? As if it mattered. He was dead as mutton. Smith frowned. In the morning he'd be off, and the document, the dead man and the blind man would be left behind. Tomorrow it would be the town again, with all its subtle alleys and dozy pockets, back to the beginning, as if that were possible. Most miserably, Smith knew there could be no returning. Wherever he went, whatever he did, Curtis Court and its long consequences would haunt him. What had the old man discovered, and why had he been so coldly done in? The blind man had been right. There'd be no peace for Smith till he knew, and little by little, as he sat by the small fire, the desire to uncover the mystery of Mr. Field's dread became as strong as his first desire to read the document itself. No more snow had fallen in the night, and now a bloodless, bewildered-looking sun stood poised on the eastern hills, as if one nudge of a cloud would topple it into snowy oblivion. Everywhere there was an air of universal crystallization, for a frost had overlaid the snow and set tiny needles on the fatted twigs of bushes, trees, and thickets that glinted sharply blue, green, and orange. Sometimes those bushes took on the shapes of men, unhorsed and frozen as they'd stumbled on. Here was a fellow with a slouched hat, there one with a great nose and a pipe, and there was another brandishing a huge pistol, fixed for the winter in a murderous aggression. Somberly, Smith wondered if such a fate had befallen Lord Tom and the two men in brown, for he and Mr. Mansfield were on the last stage of their singular journey to Prickler's Hill, and Smith was as watchful as a hawk. He sat atop the coach beside the wounded coachman, who had now recovered enough. He swore to hold the reins in his right hand, though he looked to Smith for help and support whenever the coach tipped. He'd been greatly surprised to see the weasel in his master's company, and had inadvertently said so, much confusing Charlie Parkin. Weasel? But I understood his name was Jones. I've written down Jones. Jones? He's Smith, declared the coachman. Jones? Said Mr. Mansfield. Smith, Jones, Weasel, muttered Charlie. There's more to this than meets the eye. There is indeed, agreed Mr. Mansfield, and the constable never knew why the blind man laughed. But now they were nearing the end of their journey. They skirted the village of Whetstone, and still no sign of pursuers. The house, said the coachman, jerking his head towards the eminence of Prickler's Hill. The house, built in the Palladian style, stood a third of the way up the hill, sheltered from the north by rising ground and separated from the Whetstone by an old stone church, whose yard, shrouded in snow, was the very image of the white and peaceful sleep. The coach could go no further. The road was steep and vilely slippery. The horses steamed and laboured in vain. On foot, then, said Mr. Mansfield, and he bade the coachman return into Whetstone, while he and Smith went forward on foot. Pistols, Mr. Mansfield, shall I take them? The magistrate shook his head. The gentleman from Highgate Hill seemed to have given up. No need for weapons now. Smith shrugged his shoulders, took Mr. Mansfield's hand, and began the last ascent. Though he could see nothing uneasy anywhere in the white landscape, he could not rid himself of the feeling that they were being watched closely. Where from? The house, the village, or from the quiet churchyard? He said nothing of this to Mr. Mansfield, there being no sense in alarming the blind man without just cause. Instead, he listened and commented as Mr. Mansfield talked of Mr. Field and his unlucky life. He learned with but half a mind about the disappearance and most likely death of Mr. Field's only son some years before, which had been followed by so relentless a siege of the old man and his property by his brothers, their wives, and the children that what, Mr. Mansfield? That there were suspicions, grim suspicions, that the Eager family knew more than they said about the son's death. Smith sighed. Do you think that could have been the old man's discovery, Mr. Mansfield? That he found out for certain what they'd done? Mr. Mansfield had been about to answer when he felt a sudden, strong pressure from Smith's hand. What is it, Smith? Nothing, just the cold. Smith stared towards the churchyard. He was tolerably certain he'd seen something shift, slightly and discreetly.